It's my great pleasure to be speaking to Darren Paul Fisher, who is the author of a most intriguing book about screenwriting, storytelling, film as argument. And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to Darren right now. Darren, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I know that you are the head of film, screen, and creative media at Bond University, a university I am familiar with in Queensland. Um, what prompted you to write this book?
Um, so yeah, sort of an interesting sort of slightly, non-straightforward story. Look, I was doing my PhD, and when you start a PhD, you're obviously thinking deeply about your topic or potential topics. And my one of my original loves was time travel movies. So I decided I was going to be the guy in Australia, potentially the world, to be the expert on time travel films. Obviously, not time travel as a science, you know, but everything time travel would be me, and potentially do a repository, or again, something maybe a little even more ambitious than that. But ultimately, if you want to know time travel, obviously up to the point at which the PhD was written, that would be me. And I started, and in fact, that was submitted and that was cleared, and I was in my sort of first sort of 6 months of that, and I read, and I was thinking about this interview, and I was thinking, why did I read this other article? And I couldn't tell you why. But I came across this article by a great academic, and he was making this case very well that he was like a film philosopher. So he was making the case that films couldn't argue philosophically, and they're incapable of argument because the priority is always the creative over the argumentation. So whenever it comes to it, and he was looking at a comedy. Um, and I had that light bulb moment of, again, beautifully worded, beautifully written, and I disagree with everything about it. Um, that not only was it, something that we can do in the feature film. This is specifically for feature films, but it's primarily what we are doing. Like, it wasn't just, oh, we could and we should and whatever. I was like, oh my God, we are making arguments. That is literally how I'd been trained to, without it being articulated, how I've been trained to think about feature films. And when we talk about feature films, whether we're aware of it or not, so much of what we're actually discussing is the argument of the film. So it's, in fact, it's core to the practice. And then it became a point of like, that was my instincts, but let's now investigate that from a research perspective in terms of, okay, that's my experience, what are other people's experiences? Let's look at the literature. Let's really interrogate this. Yes, I've had an epiphany, but that is just me. Let's just push down a little harder. And obviously, the more I started to research, the more excited I got. And I was like, no, I really genuinely believe this is the case. And I'm aware that it's contentious, to some degree, potentially, to a very high degree, because it also implies this secondary sort of implication that is, if that's what we're doing, it means that a large part of the people that are doing it are not aware that they're doing it. So if you say to somebody, you don't quite understand your practice, that's not a politically neutral thing to sort of express. But I genuinely believed it and I wanted to pursue it. And then I obviously met with other practitioners and practitioner academics and laid out the ideas for this. And I went off to LA, I went to USC, had conversations with them, went to UCLA, went to NYU, talking with other academics and practitioner academics to sort of get a sense of, what do you think? Testing the boats. And I mentioned it in the book, and responses, were fascinating. Most were like quite excited by it. Some were like, well, yeah, of course. Like, it's so self-evident. Why are you even having to express it? Um, and my point would be because no one's expressing it. Again, we talk about that in the book. And others were just like, how dare you? How dare you try and be so reductive as to, reduce this, and again, it is feature film specifically. You can extrapolate some of these ideas for other forms of screen content that end. And again, we can dig deeper into that, if we want to. But obviously, the research was done on kind of feature films and how can you reduce it to that? Films can be so much more. And my response has always been, and often are so much more, is that I'm talking about mainstream film and I'm talking about how it is right now, you know? So it's not like what films could be and what they should be. It's what they are. It is right now how we're taught to think about them when we make them and how we instinctively talk about them, whether we're critics or audience members when we talk about them. Like it or hate it, rage against it if you want to, but that is the practice. Doesn't mean it won't evolve, but that is just where we're at right now.
Okay, no, I understand that. That's a really interesting background. And yes, film as argument makes perfect sense because every film does present an argument or a case or a story that has to be resolved or not. In the case of some
Mm.
films,
Yeah.
whatever the case might be. So that no, that makes perfect sense. And of course, fundamental to every film is a screenplay. And there has to be a well-written screenplay that entices the audience, all that sort of thing. So I'm interested in the overlap and the interplay between writing a screenplay for a feature film and having an argument embedded in that screenplay that makes a point.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it's almost this is the weird thing, it's also indivisible. And again, just to talk about the central metaphor of the book, which I was very proud of, but it works for a certain generation and not your Gen Zers and Gen Alphas. That of the headpiece of the Staff of Ra, the Raiders of the Lost Ark medallion that they're all chasing. And that one side of that is retro is poetics from Aristotle, and that's what we always go back to as a master text. And I think it's amazing and great, and we should absolutely do that. But it's only half of it. You need the other half. You need the bit that tells you that you've got to dig in the right place because you've got to cut, some of the staff off. You need the back of that is rhetoric, is the theory of argument, because the theory of argument includes emotion. I think this is a really important thing. It's like people go, oh, but films are emotional. I'm like, yeah, so's arguments. When you actually go back to the fundamentals that Aristotle was talking about with rhetoric, the three pillars of that is, it's credibility, logic, and emotion. Like, so it was all part of that. So when I think when and I can talk about my experience of writing screenplays, and it was interesting again about the
Mm.
book is it's primarily still talking about story construction from a screenplay point of view, because again, I don't think it's that controversial, but directing is interpretation, right? So a lot of books on directing, it's all about, mastering the crafts that you need to use, vision, sound, but ultimately it's translating a work, and yes, there's another voice that can come into that, and that there can be obviously problems with that. But I think when you're building your story, I think this is again just the creative arts generally, and I said argument, I think is just the matrix of kind of how we put things together. Is I think if you start from the point of view, I think if you start writing a script from I have something to say, it's very important. And again, I also want to get away from the fact is the idea of film saying arguments that they're in any way, shape, or form worthy. We talk about worthwhile. It's not the same as worthy.
Mm.
I say the words theme to my students, and I'm like, American Pie has a theme. Like, like it's okay. Like we're not talking high end, but it sounds so worthy. Is you start from anywhere. You start from what excites you as a screenwriter. But during the development process, you have to deal with the creative voice of the piece, which should come organically from, and it is that navel gazing. Once you start to think of why does that excite me? What is interesting about that to me? What are the thematic, we talk about, if somebody says, oh, Michael Bay, I have a lot of respect for him as a craftsman. I don't think he's particularly interested in any thematic ideas whatsoever. Um, but he still understands that you have to have something to hold it together, whether or not your priorities, I want to do explosions or chases and all the rest of it. That's what kind of gets you started, but you have to have something that kind of holds that together. And it has to be, I would say, an argument. That tends to come at least in the middle of the process. Again, just again, based on my own personal experience in terms of research, in terms of when naturally it seems to come to, like, you get to a point where you then have to start dealing with those kind of creative voice questions. And for me, an argument is another way of basically talking about creative voice when it comes to feature film.
Okay, no, that makes perfect sense. I mean, you've used such a huge range of films in your book. You've selected and analyzed, and I found it fascinating. Everything from Toy Story 3 to Mulholland Drive to Barbie, whatever. I mean, which is fantastic because screenplay can range over so many different genres and approaches and animations and all sorts of things.
Mm.
How did you decide to settle on the particular films that you analyze in some detail in particular?
So it's interesting. I mean, Toy Story 3 is fascinating because it is a kind of second sequel, which traditionally tends to be whatever you think about Star Wars and Return of the Jedi. The third ones don't tend to be, always the strongest, or usually not the strongest. The idea of ever diminishing returns is generally quite accurate. Um, but for me, it was one of the most perfect examples of great storytelling before I then even which I thought of before I had even the idea for the book. And then it's just like, yeah, it is just so perfect in terms of sort of the clarity of ways that I can just use as an example. I just like this is the use case. This is like obviously Pixar, at the time of writing it, was still pretty much their only misstep was the dinosaur movie. And as during writing it, like there was Lightyear did not do particularly well, so they started to not function as well potentially as they had done. But it's also relevant that they do spend a lot of time on story and they do make sure they get it right before they go to production, which is interesting in terms of animation generally. And another area of interest for me is taking those fundamentals of animation and how those apply to live action. And I've just recently seen other people talk about the same thing. I think there's something to be learned from animation in terms of how you construct story. But again, it didn't have to be animation. It was just such a beautiful example of so many things, including that David Mamet sort of ending of the surprising yet inevitable. Like spoilers in case anybody's not seen Toy Story 3. Um, that Woody's gonna get back to Andy, but you don't really know what's gonna happen then because they've still got the same problem they had at the beginning, which is does he go to college? Does he not go to college? And you know that you can just forget about that for part of the film and you don't know where it's gonna go. And then as it gets to the end, and it's like, but of course it's the most beautiful, like you can't imagine it ending any other way, of course, and that's why they invented Bonnie. That's why it's the passing along, like, oh my God, and it's still heartrending, and people were almost crying when they're in the, about to be, melted down. But that bit when he passes it off and Woody's there, and you're like, oh, it's pretty stunning, beautifully judged storytelling. So that's fine. That was the easy one. Obviously, Mulholland Drive was a tricky one to find the counterexample because I think it's also worth saying at this point, this is about the practice of feature filmmaking, not feature films, which sounds like this terribly semantic sort of thing. But so it's like, it's not necessarily the end product. It's like we're trying to climb a mountain, right? And we may fail, right? Okay. Maybe that's probably not the best metaphor because there's no output there, but it's kind of it doesn't negate even if all the films in the mainstream were never coherent arguments, would necessarily negate that that's what we're trying to do. If that makes any sense. Harder to prove, obviously, but because the realities, and this is not against the studios, but the realities of making a film and the stakeholders and the studio system and all the rest of it, sometimes it can be lost just through the brutalities of production. Still doesn't stop the fact that's what the filmmakers are trying to do. But obviously, yes, we do get it right sometimes on purpose, by accident, whatever it is. So one of the reasons for Pixar was that obviously we can argue that they did have kind of that sort of director's cut. It was the filmmakers making the film they wanted to make. But it is about the process I'm making the point about, not necessarily the end product. So Mulholland Drive was a tricky one because you want something that is well received. Because my version of success in the book is it well argued. Um, so it's very hard to find. So I find lots of films that are not well argued, but they're just technically poor films. So you want one that is technically strong, that is universally loved even within the niche audience that is David Lynch. As much as it was unfortunate as I was writing the book, he died during the writing of the book. So there was this awful moment where I had to just redraft everything in a past tense for David Lynch. But very, very well loved. This was seen to be his best film. It's top 10 of the best films of the 20, I want to say 21st century. Um, but also had quite famously, arguably a nonsensical argument or a non-argument,
Mm.
you know, because obviously with Lynch, it's about is he going to be, you know, often people to argue about what's going on at all. Like forget about the argument. It's like, I don't understand what's happening. So it kind of had to be Lynch really, because again, I can easily pick a film in the mainstream that's just doesn't land, but doesn't mean that's not the process of trying to make something that is well argued. So it's kind of like have a film that has no argument or seems to have no argument, but is still incredibly well thought of within the people that are, you know, that justly assessed by those other measures. And then obviously we sort of go through it. Look, it is my favorite Lynch film, probably because I do think it has a very coherent argument. And I, you know, and it was interesting to juxtapose that with obviously Inland Empire. But again, slightly contentious because people will always talk about Lynch in terms of that sensory feeling and atmosphere, and that's all great. But I'd also make the case that's why he's niche, right? Because I'm talking mainstream, so it doesn't mean he won't have some success. I'm in the book, I'm attributing that success of this particular film to all the stuff he does very well at naturally. But this one also did have a very coherent argument, which I think is why it broke out a little bit more than normally would do so. And if you want to apply the normal sort of Lynchian sort of measures about atmosphere and tone, Inland Empire should have done the same thing, but it didn't. In fact, Inland Empire, you know, there was lots of talk at the time, I remember, where they were like, is he okay?
Mm.
Because you know, and I think that's a good example of there is more, whether or not you recognize there is more to certain films of his that land or pieces of work that land. And in this case, I think it was argument. The Barbie one was fun. That was completely new writing. A lot of the book was based off research from the PhD. Looking at Barbie and Frozen and Brave was not. That was all you know, specifically for the book. And there's quite a few theories which we can talk about that are in the book that, you know, so the PhD was the basis, but what happens, things evolve quite quickly. So a lot of new ideas came into the book. Um, but yeah, Barbie obviously because fascinating again when you watch it, it was an interesting case study of the three. And I've actually written about Frozen, how important I think Frozen was as a film at the time for various reasons. But again, beautifully judged, I really thought, in terms of narrative and argument. Um, Brave, the counterpoint, I think it fell down because of the way it was argued, and that affected the construction of the story. And Barbie's such a funny one, like, you know, it's it's quite clumsily argued, you know, but it does enough, you know, to kind of get across the line. You know, look, it's interesting. We talk about, you know, thematic ideas, and we often think, well, we don't go and see a film because of thematic ideas. We go because Margot Robbie's in it, or it's an action film, or whatever it is, right? That's why we go. But I always make the point that if you saw, you know, thematically films are generally about how to be a better human, right? You know, ways to enrich our lives. If you went to the movies and every movie to some degree was saying, look, you know what, if you play by the rules and be a good person, you're going to have a worse life. It's just going to suck for you because you know what, you know, unless you're a billionaire, sure, you know, whatever, there'd be no film industry, right? Like, you know,
Mm.
so we don't believe that we watch them, but we like to hear the stories. And obviously, that doesn't also reflect our own experience in the world. So I'm not saying that's a not a disingenuous take, but I think we don't realize that we do, but we do. Um, and obviously, Barbie was also a very nice demonstration of a segue into that related theory of cinema of compensation. Like the films that don't argue well, why do we still have some satisfaction from them enough to not feel we've been cheated out of our 10, 15, $20?
Mm. Okay, how interesting to hear all that. It's
That's it.
yeah. Now, I mean, obviously, you bring in your filmless argument discussion. Obviously, box office, uh, who's in it, who directed it, all that sort of thing. That's important part of developing and making a successful screenplay, I suppose. I'm interested in your focus seems to be mainly on American cinema.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, I suppose that's from your personal standpoint, or um, because I mean, looking at Australian films and especially older Australian films, Asian cinema and European cinema, I was intrigued that your main focus was American.
Yeah, I look, and I mean, and I'll have to own that one. That is my, drawing on the reservoir of knowledge that I most, have intrinsically.
Yep.
I watch less European and less, I'm a big genre fan. So, I watch a fair amount of kind of Asian cinema, but it isn't my, in terms of the wealth of knowledge, in terms of my understanding of mainstream cinema, which is more American English language led. I just have a great depth of knowledge. And obviously, in terms of what I know of my experience of watching, global, international, non-English language cinema, the fundamentals are the same when we talk about a film language. So
Hmm.
um, it didn't, for me at that point, the priority to use more examples, you know, uh, it it didn't feel as necessary to then spend another year, going through watching a lot more films that I wasn't as familiar with to make the same point. It was like I'm making the point, and
Yeah.
I genuinely think that it holds based on my lesser but still, I would argue, significant experience of other cinemas. But I'm making a point about those, yeah, those mainstream movies. I suppose within, I think I put it in the book. There is a English speaking bias. There is a kind of American bias to this, and then obviously if the person reading it goes, well, actually, you know what? you know, Asian cinema has another level or difference to it. Great for them. Great. Take my work, plug it into something that you have a greater definition than I do in that particular area, and build it or reject it. And that's kind of I'm equally happy with that.
Yep, no, that's fair enough. Now, you obviously have drawn on a number of different theoretical perspectives, and starting with Aristotle, I suppose, but
Yeah.
a number of different, and I mean, there've been so many people who advise filmmakers or whatever on screenplay writing and saying, here is the best
Mm.
way to write a screenplay. There's always a trick or something
Yeah.
you should do and have the third act sort of thing. And but your film as argument book takes a slightly different perspective, which perhaps incorporates some of that, but takes it to the next level insofar as that film has to argue its case properly.
Yeah. And I think that it was kind of fun kind of trying to conceptualize the book in that kind of it's a how-to book, but not kind of a how-to book. It's a
Hmm.
kind of very conceptual how-to book. It's not like you must have a turning point on page
Yeah.
10 and midpoint turn and I love structure, so I'm not kind of against that. That is, it should be able to fit in with all of those, but it's not contradicting any of those books. They're
Hmm.
going into the craft of maximizing the drama. My book's going, well, why are we having the drama? Like, what's the point of the drama?
Hmm.
And the element of presenting an argument as a puzzle was not in the PhD and is something in the book. And I think, potentially something we could drill down to further in terms of getting a bit more into technique and the presenting of an argument that I think, where Brave did fall down is like you kind of knew the argument. I mean, there's many problems with Brave, but you kind of the argument was like there from the trailer. So it felt a very pedestrian watch because you just kind of knew what you were being told, and it feels preachy, it feels didactic, and we can't be scared of. And again, this idea of didactic is that things like I feel like you're making an argument. You're not telling people how to think. You're just telling people what you think, right?
Hmm.
I think there's a difference, a difference there. So yeah, so obviously for me, the book is, arguing that there's almost not enough Aristotle, that I think, all these things are, have a validity.
Yes, yes. And there's always this notion that films could be perhaps more unpredictable, have a twist that surprises
Hmm.
the audience. I mean, the argument being that, oh, didn't see that coming, or wow, that was a real surprise. Of course,
Hmm.
there are a number of films that are exemplars for that. So I suppose it's a matter of type of screenplay that people write and an argument that it presupposes, and whether you want to be challenged in your thinking as well.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about what is worthwhile. So that's a big word for us.
Mm,
The idea of, is to bring the audience to a worthwhile conclusion in a worthwhile way. That's the argument, right? And they're deliberately kind of deliberately open. And what does worthwhile mean? Does it mean worthy, which it doesn't? Does it mean, and we don't even sort of say necessarily has to be true, because sometimes true things can be proved to be false later on in science. I think we talk about, the flat Earth theory. So in the mainstream, they can sort of go with those more comforting, I would say comforting lies, but comforting truths, maybe the easy truths. But again, the idea of mainstream was includes art house, that, I think you can make a very, and this may affect audience, numbers, but it means you make a good art house film. You are looking for the difficult truths, because people who go to art house typically want to be challenged or having something more interesting to chew on, more complex, more nuance, than you would from, going to your event cinemas and your multiplex. So trying to, Trojan horse in something a bit more challenging there can affect box office. But that's about target audience. That's about market. That's not about sort of whether or not they argue. What I think is really interesting about film specifically is that it's constructed as an argument, but it's also the evidence for the argument, which makes it incredibly powerful and compelling, because it is the use case, right? So it's
yeah,
like, I'm making the argument that we should all be nice to each other because X, Y, Z, and that's the film. And so the film at the same time, because the argument should not be articulated, verbally, that's the idea. Um, some filmmakers can't resist like getting the thematic argument kind of line into the film, which is problematic, but it should be through every frame. It should be the DNA of the film. It should not be articulated by a character or a speech or anything like that. It needs to be, through that. But the film itself is obviously the proof of that as well, and the thing that Aristotle talked about. Um, and so I mean, I've had these conversations with people where they'll be like, "Oh, I thought about this thing. It's confirmation bias." And, "Oh yeah, because that was that movie 10 years ago, and that's what that was about." And I'm like, "That was a movie. That is fiction. That is you made that
yeah,
up, and you are consciously or subconsciously winding that into your overall life experience as actual evidence, which is terrifying, especially in the world of AI, even more terrifying. What people will confuse, I say consciously or subconsciously, into their overall understanding of the world and arguments. So I think that's why it is very, very powerful, because it is both at once.
yeah. How interesting. I wanted to ask your opinion about filmmakers that revisit their films and uh, do extra bits, like Donnie Darko being a good example, where uh,
Okay.
that was revisited and changed around a little bit, and the narrative changed, the argument changed, and Cinema Paradiso, which had an extra 40 minutes added to it, because the
I don't think
filmmaker.
I've seen that cut. Yeah, I don't think I've seen
Ah,
the extra cut of that one.
yeah.
I feel like we've met. I often go on rants of like filmmakers revisiting their work and be like, "Stop it, put it down." I mean, my one again, very, very mainstream, is obviously George Lucas and Star Wars. Forever and ever playing around with things.
Yeah.
Always Blade Runner with the various cuts, the director's cut, the final cut. And it is artists, tweaking their work while it's still in the gallery, and I can understand that. I'm very much against it, because I feel that they are a kind of snapshot in time. That was what you made with what you had at the time. If it really was something where, say, the studio made you recut the version and it was so different in terms of whether it's argument or just other important elements to that director or filmmaker, whoever is in control of that IP, um, then sure, go back and go, you know what, it was supposed to be about this, and they made it about that, and they made it 90 minutes. It was supposed to be 3 hours, and it completely changed everything about it. The creative voice. Go ahead, give me the real, whether it's Richard Donner and Superman 2, and which I watched those cuts, and they're not that different. But the tweaking is kind of, I find it a bit irritating, because I just don't think it necessarily. Yes, the special effects are better. Look, I haven't seen the Darko. What did he do with Darko? Did he really change?
He
What
changed
did he?
some of the music, including the
Okay.
opening sequence, and he added a couple of scenes to explain Donnie's situation.
What,
So
his mental health, or so is it
yes,
clarifying mental health? Okay, yeah.
yeah, and more of the time travel stuff, etc. as well.
I need to check
Um,
that out. I'd be really interested to time travel. See, I'm interested
yes, you
uh,
mentioned.
in that one. But yeah, no, sure. Yeah, no, I just please don't. That's the film. That's the film that was released, and I think you want to make a new film.
Yes.
Make the film that is yours.
Well, my argument would be it changes the argument because then you are, in a sense, revisiting a film's screenplay and changing your approach, your argument, and the way you want the audience to respond.
Yeah, and it could be, and it could just be a small scene. It could be that scene that now we realize that he's having, for instance, mental health issues that was maybe only alluded to or we missed in the first version. That
Mm.
changes how we interact with that character in terms of sympathy potentially, which can have quite a big knock-on effect. I mean, we talk about, I think, I'm not sure if I mentioned it in the book, but it's the end of The Graduate. Where they keep the camera rolling. And I think that's a very incredible 10, 20 seconds of cinema because it completely changes the voice of the film. Just the
Mm.
last 20 seconds, because he makes a grand gesture. Again, spoiler alert, makes a grand gesture, and if it cuts away, then it's like, it's a very aspirational, he made the right choice, and young love and all of that. And then they sit on the bus, and he obviously this was the director just keeping it rolling to see what happened. I find it a bit of a disingenuous, not a moment in the film, but in terms of why the actors made the choices they did because they didn't have dialogue. So they couldn't talk to each other. So they're kind of like waiting for the camera. They're trying to stay in character, but they can't really talk because there isn't dialogue, and they kind of run with it, and it gets really awkward and weird. And of course, he keeps it in, and it is that moment after Happy Ever After of like, oh God, I think the grand gesture was amazing, but it was probably the wrong choice. They fell in love with the grand gesture, and that's a feature film, and an extra 10 seconds completely changes the argument. And that's the one that I think makes it very counterculture. I don't think I think that's the moment. It's not, the stuff that preceded it. Yes, there's moments that we can talk about. Actually, just a funny aside on that one, and because unfortunately, obviously, Robert Redford's no longer with us, and he was the first person they approached him for The Graduates, and apparently they realized he was wrong for the role because the producer said, Robert, when you strike out with a girl, and he had no idea what he was talking about, had no frame of reference for that whatsoever. And I'm like, yeah, it's probably not going to understand the character much. So then obviously it went for Dustin Hoffman. So yes, I think it is very delicate. So revisiting, even if it's the music only, it can have a very radical knock-on effect. But I suppose for me, maybe I'm arguing the opposite, that if the original film had the wrong argument for you, you had to change the argument to get it out in the world. Maybe that is a reason to go back and recut,
Ah,
not just to kind of tweak bits and bobs.
yep. Okay. My Zoom is going to run out in about 5 minutes, and
Okay.
I wanted to ask you because you've won awards for your screenwriting and films, etc. Can you just briefly describe the sorts of films that you've been involved with and you've made and so on?
Okay. So my journey was kind of interesting. So I started in teen comedy.
Ah,
And in fact, I was known, it was not on purpose because obviously they're the ones that get made. Obviously, you have a grand plan of the films you want to make, and then there's the ones that you can get made. I was a big John Hughes fan back in the day. And unfortunately, again, God, talking about people who die all the time in this industry. So he died, and I got a call from Sky News in the UK, where I'm from originally. And they asked me to basically give his on-screen eulogy for the news, which was incredibly flattering. Um, and I only realized why when I was on screen and somebody told me about it. I still have never seen the footage. And apparently it was Darren Fisher, teen movie director. I was like the only guy in the UK making teen movies. There was no one else making teen films. I'd made two. I'd made one called In-Betweeners, and then I'd made one called Popcorn.
uh-huh.
Um, um, but that wasn't any stuff that I was writing. I loved my science fiction. I love my genre stuff. But those were the stuff that obviously could get financed because they don't cost as much money. And so that's kind of how I sort of began. So I started with that low budget feature world. And then, decided to really, make sure the third one wasn't a teen film. Not that I, have anything against teen films, but I'd done my teen films. And then Frequencies was, kind of my passion. And so that was what I love is speculative fiction, that I kind of, alternate reality. I'm not massive about the shiny spaceships. I just like the conceptual stuff. Change one thing, what does it do? So that was a film that was based on the idea that what if luck was real? I'm quite obsessed with luck. And the ideas surrounding that. And so yeah, so that was based on it was a kind of Romeo and Juliet style story around the kind of the was luckiest boy, it was luckiest girl, was unluckiest boy meet, and we have basically a film about free will and determinism, all those fun things that I kind of wrapped around a love story, because I want to explore those very self-indulgent ideas that are very kind of hard philosophy, but do it through an emotional story, and that did remarkably well, which is very 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 exciting. And we're working on the TV series actually at the moment, which is fun. Although the TV series will be a different genre. So TV series is going to be a thriller,
Ah,
set in the same universe. So that's going to be fun. So yes, the stuff I'm working on at the moment, cuts across kind of all of that, but mostly speculative fiction at the moment.
okay, excellent to hear that. And you're enjoying your work at Bond University, instructing students how to write good screenplays or whatever.
Yeah, love it. Just absolutely love it. And there's so much. I mean, when you look at any, it's interesting. I mean, this someone should write a paper on it. Maybe they have, but there's filmmakers love teaching. Like it's just a commensurate job. Like we love to go in and out of education, no matter how successful directors are, they love coming back and speaking with students and lecturing and talking, and it just feeds itself. So it's great, and you learn. And the great thing about teaching is you learn so much from the students. You understand how tastes are evolving, how they're engaging with, different platforms and media and where they're going, and yeah, it influences your own work, and obviously you're giving to them and they're obviously giving back to you. So it's all amazing.
Okay, excellent stuff. It's been my great pleasure to be speaking to Darren Paul Fisher, the author of Film as Argument, now available in bookstores everywhere, and highly recommend it. It's a really fascinating read. Darren, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye bye.
All right, bye bye.